Before I, I accepted the invitation, and before I determined what I actually wanted to talk about, I was looking to see what others had been discussing in the series. And I did notice there weren't so many of us talking about applications of corpora to language teaching. And so that's part of why I wanted to do this talk here. So just a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk about 3 areas that I think that corpora are currently used, but could be used more in curriculum development and ESP, including needs analysis, which is probably the most common area that we see it in, materials development, and then assessment and evaluation. And again, I'm focusing on 2 under-resourced areas in ESP, healthcare communication and pronunciation. But I was pleased to see that at the Corpus Linguistics Conference in 2019, there was a plenary on healthcare communication and corpora. And just last week at the Teaching and Language Corpora Conference, there was a plenary on pronunciation and corpus-based methods of instruction. And so I do think there's an interest in this, and you all being here shows that there is, so thank you. And I think, but there's lots of work to be done. So hopefully today I'll give you some ideas. I'm also going to be drawing on 2 other corpus-based curriculum development projects, which are the Corpus and Repository of Writing and the Multilingual Academic Corpus of Assignments, Writing, and Speech. And so these are 2 learner corpora that I've been developing at University of Arizona with lots of wonderful colleagues and students. So I'll bring those in a little bit just to give you a little bit of a broader view of how we can apply some of these same principles to other contexts. And then on the, I'm not sure, it's probably your left, am I right? Just to point out, there are a number of publications if you're interested in reading more, particularly about this healthcare context, including publications in ESP Journal. But also, I think I highlighted my most recent publication, which is in the TESOL newsletter for ESP. And I think it's important as we're thinking about moving corpora into the classroom to also be reaching teachers in venues and in ways that is meaningful to them. So a little bit about the context that I'll be talking about today and the course that I developed. So this was a course for internationally educated nurses. They did identify their English as their second language, but they're highly proficient users of English. Most of them are from the Philippines, and you can see here I am with some of them wonderful nurses that I worked with for this project. So the course that the hospital that I was working with asked me to deliver was pronunciation for nurses. So why pronunciation? Well, pronunciation has been identified as a need for internationally educated nurses. So just to define that term, these are nurses who've been educated outside the US and are working in the US. And again, many of them identify English as a second language. So in the nurse education literature, this has actually been identified as a primary need. But if you look at what is actually being offered to these nurses, most of the time it's really focused on accent modification, which is very different from how we teach pronunciation and apply linguistics. And more specifically, it's not usually connected so much to pragmalinguistic aspects of language use. So other needs analyses have also identified pronunciation or other language features as places to focus for international nurses. They've also identified what is called therapeutic communication as an area of need. And this is building rapport with patients, it's showing empathy, it's also including patients in the plan of care is what we mean by therapeutic communication. But you don't see a lot of people making the connection between the pragmalinguistic aspects and these functional aspects of language use. So that was part of the motivation. To take a step back before getting into the specifics of the course and the study that I did to develop the materials for the course, I wanted to talk a little bit about these 3 areas. I'll go into them a little in more detail as I go through the talk, but within needs analysis, you know, Tono has identified, and we often think about the target situation. And we have done a lot of studies, corpus linguists have done a lot of studies that I think contribute to target situation analysis. So looking at a language domain, many times a very specialized situation, and using that as a way to understand the needs of learners. We can also use Corpora, though, to talk about the present situation analysis. And so this is something that Tono brings out too, but to emphasize, this is where we might bring in more learner corpora into our needs analysis. That's been done somewhat, but is less of a focus if you look at, say, for example, articles in ESP Journal. And then a second area can be materials development. There's lots of really great examples of this, but I would like to highlight Susan Conrad's work with her civil engineering writing project. If you're not familiar with that, I highly recommend checking it out. So she's used multidimensional analysis to look at civil engineering texts produced by students and practitioners, and looking at differences between them. And then working really closely with teachers of civil engineering and practitioners to develop materials. And so this is very much in line with what we do as ESP curriculum developers, but so often these materials stay in-house, they're ad hoc, and so I think that corpora have, you know, corpus linguists and corpora have a real role to play to broaden this and move it out of these, you know, very ad hoc situations. And then finally, thinking about assessment and evaluation, especially assessment, I think as corpus linguists, we've also done a lot, and myself included, with high stakes assessments. So I've done studies on TOEFL, and I'm doing one on IELTS now. But we've done less looking at classroom assessment, and I think it's a really rich tool that we can use, particularly if we're thinking about ways to evaluate the corpus-based materials that we've developed. We can then evaluate them through corpus-based approaches as well. So that's a little highlight of the 3 areas. I'm going to get into more detail on corpus-based needs analysis first. So again, we've seen lots of examples of how corpora can be used for this purpose. You know, just thinking about the word lists that have been developed. This is an example of doing a target situation analysis using a corpus and having something concrete come out of that. However, as I said before, often we're not using learner corpora for these means. And here I'm thinking also really importantly of using them to show learners what is a successful example of a learner's production in these contexts. So I think I've done a better job of this with my new project, the newer project, the Corpus and Repository of Writing, but really drawing on the students' text to develop materials for students, so that in a sense they're learning from the successful students that have come before them. I'll bring that a little bit into this talk too, but again, I think I've done a better job with that project. For the present situation analysis, again, this is less commonly done, but here we can use learner corpora for this. In ESP, often what we're looking for in present situation analysis is quote unquote lacks of the learner. And I think, you know, yes, we want to look for those gaps, but we should be careful, first of all, to make sure that when we are doing, let's say, L1, L2 comparisons, that we're setting up fair comparisons so that we're using comparable corpora to look at the 2 types of speakers. And I also think that we can go further in thinking about how effective the writing or the speaking in this case is by employing external assessment measures alongside this kind of contrastive corpus analysis, because we know that not all L1 speakers are as effective as others, and there are definitely L2 speakers that are more effective than L1 speakers. So this is kind of another way to think about the way that we use corpora in needs analysis. So, not surprisingly, if you know where I come from, I use a corpus-based register analysis when I am analyzing corpora, and that's what I used for the needs analysis as well. And I think it works really well for this purpose because it asks you to not only look at the linguistic features, but also the situational context. So the situational context for the course that I'm describing today, I looked at both internationally educated nurses and US nurses in their interactions with patients, and these are what are known as standardized patients. So these are not actual patients. There's some limitations to that I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. They are working in a hospital in the US, as I said. They're already in-service nurses, and also just thinking about what are the important things, you know, in this environment. Things like patient satisfaction is very important in the US. Also, this idea of therapeutic communication, which again can include empathy and rapport. For this talk, I'm focusing on pronunciation features. And so what you might notice is these are not segmental features. These are very much focused on suprasegmental features, which, as those of you who know about pronunciation teaching and applied linguistics, we're very much promoting those as features that really make much more of a difference in terms of intelligibility, but also, you know, you'll see as I go through this talk, they also make a huge difference in terms of conveying certain functions. So here I'll talk more about how I operationalize these three variables, but it's pitch range, tone choice, and prominence are what I'm looking at. And then the third part of the triangle for corpus-based register analysis that I think is really important and sometimes gets lost in terms of needs analysis is this functional interpretation. So here's where we can bring in things like, okay, so we know that empathy is important. How are the nurses enacting that linguistically? And here specifically, how are these pronunciation features serving that function? This also comes out in things like greetings. And then the third area that I'm going to be looking at today is information structure. So how does pronunciation contribute to the communication of important ideas, important information? So the corpus that I used for the needs analysis, like I said, it included both internationally educated and US educated nurses, about 50 of each. And then they were interacting with what are called standardized patients. So these are actors that are trained to portray a patient in the same way to a number of healthcare providers. And they're used a lot in the assessment of both doctors and nurses. So again, this is a disadvantage. They're not a real patient, but the advantage of this is that they're all presenting the same case. So the language used within these interactions is similar, and you can expect to find certain things within these interactions as you'll see as I go through this. So already, if you look at the length of the interaction, you can see that the US nurses did take more time with these patients. The pronunciation variables that I'm looking at here include pitch range, and that's just the max min on particular utterances. And I think, you know, when you're thinking about employing pronunciation analysis in a corpus, it's really important, first of all, to do some pilot work to determine where you're going to really see some meaningful differences, and then also to think about going to a lower level of analysis on the level of, say, a speech act, where you can identify the function of those pronunciation features. So I looked at greetings and introductions and what I'm calling the empathetic response. So as I said, all of the patients were presenting the same case to the nurses. And in this particular case, the patient's father has just died. So the nurse knows this. It's in a chart that the nurse actually gets before they interact with the patient. The patient also knows that they should bring it up if the nurse doesn't bring it up. So this is a reliable place to look for this type of empathetic response. And then related to the pitch range is tone choice. And I'm just using a very simplified system here of falling, rising, and level tone. But basically, you know, thinking again about this empathetic response and what the pitch change was on that. And then finally, the third variable that I looked at was prominence. So I looked at this as number of prominent words per total number of words. Prominence you could think about as sentence stress. So basically, where is the nurse stressing words? And in this case, also, again, I went to a specific section of the discourse. Namely, it's called a counsel phase, where the nurse is providing information to the patient. And so this is where that use of stress will be most meaningful because the patient needs to know what are the important words, and that's what the stress is conveying. And this is just to show I used both PROT and a program called Computerized Speech Lab to do the analysis. So for the data analysis, I looked at frequencies of each of the features for each speaker within each interaction. I did compare them statistically, you know, using t-test or u-test, depending on the normality. And then I also mentioned bringing in other assessments to look at this, because these comparisons were across the US and internationally educated nurses. But I also looked at the correlation of the linguistic features with two measures: a patient satisfaction measure, which was a rating that each patient gave directly after the nurse interacted with them, and then also an interpersonal skills assessment, which is a assessment measure that's used for the US medical licensing exam, but we adapted it here for our purposes. So the results from the Corpus study showed that there were actually significant differences across most of these variables, the exception being the proportion of rising tone. So what I'd like to highlight here is that the pitch range was quite different depending on the speech act, right? So in greetings, the internationally educated nurses were using a broader pitch range than the US nurses, while it was the opposite on the empathetic response. So this is not a case of, you know, for some lower level speakers of English, they may not have a very broad pitch range in general. That was not the case for these nurses. They were able to use pitch pretty broadly, but they were not doing it on the empathetic response. So I thought that was really interesting. And then in terms of the tone choice, what you can see from the internationally educated nurses is they really weren't choosing one particular tone overall. You know, they chose them all, whereas the US nurses were choosing the falling tone on the empathetic response. And the level tone is the one that's most notably different between the two groups. And then finally, for prominence, you can see that the internationally educated nurses were stressing more words than the US nurses. So when we look at the relationship between these pronunciation variables and the two assessments, there were significant correlations for 3 of them. So a broader pitch range on the empathetic response was associated with a higher score on the interpersonal skills assessment. And also there was a negative correlation with level tone and prominence, so that you know, the level tone, the more level tone was associated with lower scores, as was more prominence. So I thought that this helped me to see this kind of triangulation of results helped me to see where some of the needs might be for these internationally educated nurses. And this is just a visualization, and this is actually what I used for the materials, as you'll see later on. And this just shows the pitch range. So the blue line is the pitch, the fundamental frequency that's used both for pitch range, and then you can also see there's not a lot of movement. So this also represents a level tone. We can contrast that here with the change in the pitch range and also the falling tone that's used. And you can see the words they're saying are pretty much the same. So it's really, the difference here is in the pronunciation. So just to conclude from the needs analysis, I saw that there was differences in both the greetings and the empathetic statements between the two nurse groups. That tone choice was more likely to fall for the US nurses, but there was not really a consistency in how the internationally educated nurses were using tone. And there was much greater prominence by the internationally educated nurses. And then there was this relationship for 3 of the variables, the pitch range, level tone, and prominent words with the overall effectiveness measures. So taking this and then moving into materials development and course delivery, again, as I said before, the hospital wanted to focus on pronunciation, and so that was where I was bringing in my corpus-based analysis. Taking a step back before we look at the course itself, I think that you know, we already know that Corpora can be a rich source for materials creation, but I think again we could be drawing a bit more on L2 Corpora. One of the most popular ways to bring Corpora into the classroom is through the concordance line, and there's lots of support and enthusiasm for direct data-driven learning, but I think we can think about other ways as well. So text excerpts, for example, in a writing class can be really helpful for kind of extending on the idea of modeling for students that teachers are already doing. We can also show just kind of general frequency information as a way to introduce learners to, let's say, a new context. So for example, with the corpus and repository of writing, we're showing differences across the assignments as to what are keywords and what are frequent words, so that students can get an idea of the conventions of the genre as they're starting to write. So for pronunciation, we have to be a little bit more creative and use different types of materials, because we can't, you know, the concordance line isn't really going to work for us. So in the plenary at Talc, there was a nice illustration of how you could use audio link transcripts. And so basically you could do a word search, but then that would be linked to a sound file where the learner could listen to an example of the pronunciation of a word, and they had actually error coded it, so you could hear an incorrect and a correct version of the word. Here, I'm drawing on something that's really common in pronunciation teaching, which is using PROT and the pictures that come out of PROT to visualize for the learners, because, you know, intonation is not something that's easy to visualize on your own, and so this is just an aid to understand what's going on with the speech stream. So I use these pictures from my corpus. I actually had to create sound files to accompany the pictures because I couldn't use the nurses' voices. That wasn't part of the IRB. But during the course, the pronunciation course, nurses heard the examples. They could follow along with the prop pictures. They were directed to discuss differences in the use of pronunciation, and also, I think really importantly, the functional impact of that pronunciation. And then they have practiced these in both controlled settings and in role plays where they really had to apply this functionally to empathetic response, greeting, and then prominence on when they were giving information to patients in a role play. So the course that I'm describing is actually building on a course that I had originally taught myself, but then trained other teachers to teach. And I actually think this was a good opportunity because so many times I think with corpus-based instruction, we have the situation where we have both the researcher and the teacher as the same person. And of course, we're really enthusiastic about bringing this in the classroom, and we're very skilled at describing corpora and giving students the background that they might need to understand where these materials are coming from and why they might want to use them in the first place. But if we want to expand beyond that single researcher and teacher, we really have to be able to involve teachers that don't have the same training and background that we do. So I created a teacher's guide and explanations of how to use these corpus-based materials that I developed. And I think also another aspect is thinking about how these are embedded within courses. So it's generally not the case that the corpus-based materials are the only things that you're using in a given class. And so thinking about how to integrate that with more traditional materials is a really important part of the course development. So here's just an example. I know you can't see really the words here, but maybe you recognize the pictures here, especially for the effective pitch range and intonation on empathetic statements. So you can see here the example that is showing the greater pitch range, and the example that's showing the very narrow pitch range and kind of giving a little bit of a functional interpretation as well. And this is just to show that, again, I gave pretty extensive instructions, and I think this is helpful because, again, if we're not the ones delivering the course, we need to provide a lot of scaffolding for using these kinds of materials. So, and you can see here that I was also drawing on a lot of widely used textbooks. I also brought in other ESP materials that are not corpus-based at all. So again, just a little bit more on the teachers, because I do think this is an important element as we're thinking about implementing corpus-based methods in language teaching. So these teachers that deliver the course, they actually had very little experience with pronunciation teaching. They even had very little formal TESOL training. And so this was definitely a challenge. But again, I think providing lots of scaffolding for the instructors really was important in this kind of situation. So moving on to the assessment and how we can use Corpora for assessment in classroom-based settings. Here, I mean, really it's about bringing the same principles of analysis that you would use on a large-scale study. So, you know, if your target features are the ones that you're targeting in your corpus-based materials, then you are going to integrate the same type of analysis that you would do in other corpus-based contexts. So this is what I did in my class is for the features that I was interested in looking at, the pitch range, the tone choice, and the prominence, I really used the same methods of analysis as I did on the corpus itself. And then also thinking about pre and post testing, again, incorporating something that is discourse based into those pre and post test analyses. That's good practice anyway. And then that enables you to use these methods. You can also think about doing this for an entire course, which is what I did here, or you might want to do it after a single unit. So again, coming back to the corpus and repository of writing materials that I'm developing, we're looking at, we're implementing materials in a unit that leads up to a particular paper that the students are writing, and we're able to then look at drafts before and after they use the materials, and using that as part of our assessment. So just to give you a little bit more detail on the assessment that I did for this class, there was just one pre-post test. I'll also bring in some discussion of the evaluation of the course through course evaluations and interviews with the nurses and the teachers. So for the pre and the post test, again, a lot of this was not corpus-based, but it did follow principles of applied linguistics. And then it had an evaluation of the corpus-based materials in the form of role plays that the nurses were asked to do in both the pre and the post test. And you can see these are really tied to a very specific situation, but it also relates to the particular features that I was looking at. So the teachers administered this pre and post test, and part of why I wanted to provide them with a lot of information about this assessment is that this was intended to give them a way to target more closely the needs of their students. And so this is, you know, common practice in an ESP setting, but just to emphasize that I'm integrating here lots of other types of analyses along with the corpus analysis. I analyzed the corpus-based portion of the evaluation, again, using the same principles that I used for the analysis of the larger corpus. And then I used a second coder to verify my analysis, as I did with the corpus itself. So here are the results of the pre and post test. We can see that for most of the variables, there was a change, or actually, sorry, for the pitch range on empathetic response, for the proportion level tone, and for the prominence, there was a change from the pre to the post test. And these actually ended up being the ones that I was most interested in seeing the change in, and so this was a positive outcome. So there was an increase in pitch range on the empathetic response from the pre to the post test, as well as you can see in the post test, nobody was using level tone, so they got that message about what that was conveying. And then for prominence, the number of stressed words went down, so it's 40% of the stressed words instead of 52%. So in terms of the effectiveness of the course, the nurses found it effective. The only thing that they had to issue with was that they wanted more time for the class. And I just bring this out because, again, I think it's important to look at how this type of material can be implemented in a course where you don't have somebody who's an expert in corpus linguistics. And here it was very successful, so that was great. The nurses also said they, you know, in the interviews that I did, I was only able to do 2, but they really emphasized the usefulness of the focus on the suprasegmentals and how effective the instructors were despite this lack of training. So that was good. The teachers definitely felt that they, you know, that the nurses improved in their pronunciation, but they, not surprisingly, emphasized that they needed more training. There was a lot of, they had to take a lot of time to prepare, but they were enthusiastic and they were very effective. So to just conclude, I hope that you have maybe some ideas for areas in your own work where you might be able to employ corpus-based analysis for needs analysis, materials development, and classroom-based assessment. I think, you know, although we do have some examples, great examples of how corpora have been used for ESP, and they are certainly praised for their ability to help us out in this domain. I think we need a lot more integration into course materials and assessments. And also, I think, you know, just the realization that we can use corpora for this more specialized language skill like pronunciation, but we have to think about how the materials may look different. And also thinking more about how teachers without as much training can implement these materials successfully. Okay, I'll end there and take your questions.